Chapter 4 of Narrative of the Life of David Crockett of the State of Tennessee. I continued in this down-spirited situation for a good long time, until one day I took my rifle and started a-hunting. While out, I made a call at the house of a Dutch widow, who had a daughter that was well enough as to smartness, but she was as ugly as a stone fence. She was, however, quite talkative, and soon begun to laugh at me about my disappointment. She seemed disposed, though, to comfort me as much as she could, and for that purpose told me to keep in good heart, that there was as good fish in the sea as had ever been caught out of it. I doubted this very much, but whether or not, I was certain that she was not one of them, for she was so homely that it almost gave me a pain in the eyes to look at her. But I couldn't help thinking that she had intended what she had said as a banter for me to court her, the last thing in creation I could have thought of doing. I felt little inclined to talk on the subject, it is true, but to pass off the time I told her I thought I was born odd, and that no fellow to me could be found. She protested against this, and said if I would come to their reaping, which was not far off, she would show me one of the prettiest little girls there I had ever seen. She added that the one who had deceived me was nothing to be compared with her. I didn't believe a word of all this, for I had thought that such a piece of flesh and blood as she was had never been manufactured, never would again. I agreed with her, though, as the little varmint had treated me so bad that I ought to forget her, and yet I couldn't do it. I concluded the best way to accomplish it was to cut it out again, and see if I could find any other that would answer me. So I told the Dutch girl I would be at the reaping, and would bring as many as I could with me. I employed my time pretty generally in giving information of it, as far as I could, until the day came, and I then offered to work for my old friend, the Quaker, 2 days if he would let his bound boy go with me one to the reaping. He refused, and reproved me pretty considerable roughly for my proposition, and said if he was in my place, he wouldn't go, that there would be a great deal of bad company there, and that I had been so good a boy he would be sorry for me to get a bad name. But I knowed my promise to the Dutch girl, and I was resolved to fulfill it, so I shouldered my rifle and started by myself. When I got to the place, I found a large company of men and women, and among them an old Irish woman who had a great deal to say. I soon found out from my Dutch girl that this old lady was the mother of the little girl she had promised me, though I had not yet seen her. She was in an outhouse with some of the youngsters, and had not yet made her appearance. Her mamma, however, was no way bashful. She came up to me and began to praise my red cheeks, and said she had a sweetheart for me. I had no doubt she had been told what I come for, and all about it. In the evening I was introduced to her daughter. I must confess, I was plaguey well pleased with her from the word go. She had a good countenance, and was very pretty, and I was full bent on making up an acquaintance with her. It was not long before the dancing commenced, and I asked her to join me in a reel. She very readily consented to do so, and after we had finished our dance I took a seat alongside of her, and entered into a talk. I found her very interesting. While I was setting by her, making as good a use of my time as I could, her mother came to us, and very jocularly called me her son-in-law. This rather confused me, but I looked on it as a joke of the old lady, and tried to turn it off as well as I could. But I took care to pay as much attention to her through the evening as I could. I went on the old saying of salting the cow to catch the calf. I soon become so much pleased with this little girl that I began to think the Dutch girl had told me the truth when she said there were still good fish in the sea. We continued our frolic till near day, when we joined in some plays calculated to amuse youngsters. I had not often spent a more agreeable night. In the morning, however, we all had to part, and I found my mind had become much better reconciled than it had been for a long time. I went home to the Quaker's, and made a bargain to work with his son for a low-priced horse. He was the first one I'd ever owned, and I was to work 6 months for him. I had been engaged very closely 5 or 6 weeks, when this little girl run in my mind so that I concluded I must go and see her and find out what sort of people they were at home. I mounted my horse and away I went to where she lived, and when I got there I found her father a very clever old man, and the old woman as talkative as ever. She wanted badly to find out all about me, and as I thought, to see how I would do for her girl. I had not yet seen her about, and I began to feel some anxiety to know where she was. In a short time, however, my impatience was relieved, as she arrived at home from a meeting to which she had been. There was a young man with her, who I soon found was disposed to set up claim to her, as he was so attentive to her that I could hardly get to slip in a word edgeways. I began to think I was barking up the wrong tree again, but I was determined to stand up to my rack, fodder or no fodder. And so, to know her mind a little on the subject, I began to talk about starting, as I knowed she would then show some sign from which I could understand which way the wind blowed. It was then near night, and my distance was 15 miles home. At this my little girl soon began to indicate to the other gentleman that his room would be the better part of his company. At length she left him, and came to me, and insisted mighty hard that I should not go that evening. And indeed, from all her actions and the attempt she made to get rid of him, I saw that she preferred me all holler. But it wasn't long before I found trouble enough in another quarter. Her mother was deeply enlisted for my rival, and I had to fight against her influence as well as his. But the girl herself was the prize I was fighting for, and as she welcomed me, I was determined to lay siege to her, let what would happen. I commenced a close courtship, having cornered her from her old beau, while he set off looking on like a poor man at a country frolic, and all the time almost gritting his teeth with pure disappointment. But he didn't dare to attempt anything more, for now I had gotten a start, and I looked at him every once in a while as fierce as a wildcat. I stayed with her until Monday morning, and then I put out for home. It was about 2 weeks after this that I was sent for to engage in a wolf hunt, where a great number of men were to meet with their dogs and guns, and where the best sort of sport was expected. I went as large as life, but I had to hunt in strange woods and in a part of the country which was very thinly inhabited. While I was out it clouded up, and I began to get scared, and in a little while I was so much so that I didn't know which way home was, nor anything about it. I set out the way I thought it was, but it turned out with me, as it always does with a lost man, I was wrong, and took exactly the contrary direction from the right one. And for the information of young hunters, I will just say in this place that whenever a fellow gets bad lost, the way home is just the way he don't think it is. This rule will hit 9 times out of 10. I went ahead, though, about 6 or 7 miles, when I found night was coming on fast. But at this distressing time, I saw a little woman streaking it along through the woods like all wrath. So I cut on too, for I was determined I wouldn't lose sight of her that night any more. I run on till she saw me, and she stopped, for she was as glad to see me as I was to see her, as she was lost as well as me. When I came up to her, who should she be but my little girl, that I had been paying my respects to. She had been out hunting her father's horses, and had missed her way, and had no knowledge where she was, or how far it was to any house, or what way would take us there. She had been traveling all day, and was mighty tired, and I would have taken her up and toted her, if it hadn't been that I wanted her just where I could see her all the time, for I thought she looked sweeter than sugar, and by this time I loved her almost well enough to eat her. At last I came to a path that I knowed must go somewhere, and so we followed it till we came to a house at about dark. Here we stayed all night. I sat up all night courting, and in the morning we parted. She went to her home, from which we were distant about 7 miles, and I to mine, which was 10 miles off. I now turned in to work again, and it was about 4 weeks before I went back to see her. I continued to go occasionally, until I had worked long enough to pay for my horse, by putting in my gun with my work to the man I had purchased from, and then I began to count whether I was to be deceived again or not. At our next meeting, we set the day for our wedding, and I went to my father's and made arrangements for an infare, and returned to ask her parents for her. When I got there, the old lady appeared to be mighty wrathy, and when I broached the subject, she looked at me as savage as a meat axe. The old man appeared quite willing and treated me very clever, but I hadn't been there long before the old woman as good as ordered me out of her house. I thought I would put her in mind of old times and see how that would go with her. I told her she had called me her son-in-law before I had attempted to call her my mother-in-law, and I thought she ought to cool off. But her Irish was up too high to do anything with her, so I quit trying. All I cared for was to have her daughter on my side, which I knowed was the case then. But how soon some other fellow might knock my nose out of joint again, I couldn't tell. I, however, felt rather insulted at the old lady, and I thought I wouldn't get married in her house. And so I told her girl that I would come the next Thursday and bring a horse, bridle, and saddle for her, and she must be ready to go. Her mother declared I shouldn't have her, but I knowed I should, if somebody else didn't get her before Thursday. I then started, bidding him good day, and went by the house of a justice of the peace, who lived on the way to my father's, and made a bargain with him to marry me. When Thursday came, all necessary arrangements were made at my father's to receive my wife, and so I took my eldest brother and his wife and another brother and a single sister that I had and 2 other young men with me, and cut out to her father's house to get her. We went on until we got within 2 miles of the place, where we met a large company that had heard of the wedding and were waiting. Some of that company went on with my brother and sister, and the young man I had picked out to wait on me. When they got there, they found the old lady as wrathy as ever. However, the old man filled their bottle, and the young men returned in a hurry. I then went on with my company, and when I arrived, I never pretended to dismount from my horse, but rode up to the door and asked the girl if she was ready, and she said she was. I then told her to light on the horse I was leading, and she did so. Her father, though, had gone out to the gate, and when I started, he commenced persuading me to stay and marry there, that he was entirely willing to the match, and that his wife, like most women, had entirely too much tongue, but that I oughtn't to mind her. I told him if she would ask me to stay and marry at her house, I would do so. With that, he sent for her, and after they had talked for some time out by themselves, she came to me and looked at me mighty good, and asked my pardon for what she had said, and invited me to stay. She said it was the first child she had ever had to marry, and she couldn't bear to see her go off in that way, that if I would light, she would do the best she could for us. I couldn't stand everything, and so I agreed, and we got down and went in. I sent off then for my parson, and got married in a short time, for I was afraid to wait long for fear of another defeat. We had as good treatment as could be expected, and that night all went on well. The next day we cut out for my father's, where we met a large company of people that had been waiting a day and a night for our arrival. We passed the time quite merrily, till the company broke up, and having gotten my wife, I thought I was completely made up, and needed nothing more in the whole world. But I soon found this was all a mistake, for now having a wife, I wanted everything else, and worse than all, I had nothing to give for it. I remained a few days at my father's, and then went back to my new father-in-law's, where, to my surprise, I found my old Irish mother in the finest humor in the world. She gave us 2 likely cows and calves, which, though it was a small marriage portion, was still better than I'd expected, and indeed it was about all I ever got. I rented a small farm and cabin, and went to work, but I had much trouble to find out a plan to get anything to put in my house. At this time, my good old friend the Quaker came forward to my assistance, and gave me an order to a store for $15 worth of such things as my little wife might choose. With this, we fixed up pretty grand, as we thought, and allowed to get on very well. My wife had a good wheel, and knowed exactly how to use it. She was also a good weaver, as most of the Irish are, whether men or women, and being very industrious with her wheel, she had little or no time of fine web of cloth, ready to make up, and she was good at that too, and at almost anything else that a woman could do. We worked on for some years, renting ground and paying high rent, until I found it wasn't the thing it was cracked up to be, and that I couldn't make a fortune at it just at all. So I concluded to quit it, and cut out for some new country. In this time we had 2 sons, and I found I was better at increasing my family than my fortune. It was therefore the more necessary that I should hunt some better place to get along, and as I knowed I would have to move at some time, I thought it was better to do it before my family got too large, that I might have less to carry. The Duck and Elk River country was just beginning to settle, and I determined to try that. I had now one old horse and a couple of 2-year-old colts. They were both broke to the halter, and my father-in-law proposed that if I went, he would go with me and take one horse to help me move. So we all fixed up, and I packed my 2 colts with as many of my things as they could bear, and away we went across the mountains. We got on well enough and arrived safely in Lincoln County, on the head of the Mulberry Fork of Elk River. I found this a very rich country, and so knew that game of different sorts was very plenty. It was here that I began to distinguish myself as a hunter, and to lay the foundation for all my future greatness. But mighty little did I know of what sort it was going to be. Of deer and smaller game I killed abundance, but the bear had been much hunted in those parts before, and were not so plenty as I could have wished. I lived here in the years 1809 and 10, to the best of my recollection, and then I moved to Franklin County and settled on Beans Creek, where I remained till after the close of the last war. End of chapter 4.